Aperture.
Thank you for coming. It's a great crowd, considering the rain. The Aperture Foundation, in collaboration with the Department of Photography at Parsons The New School for Design, is pleased to present photographers LaToya, Frazier, and Dawoud Bey in conversation, followed by a book signing of Ms. Frazier's book, The Notion of Family. Frazier's work offers an incisive exploration of the legacy of racism and economic decline in America's small towns, as embodied by her hometown of Braddock, Pennsylvania. The work also considers the impact of that decline on the community and on her family, creating a statement both personal and genuinely political. An intervention in the histories and the narratives of the region. Frazier and Bey, well known for its community-based portraiture work, will discuss the creation of Frazier's first book, The Notion of Family, and the ideas and issues that inform her practice, along with the ways in which photography can provide provoke an active conversation in the larger social world. LaToya Frazier was born in Braddock, Pennsylvania. She received her BFA in photography and graphic design in 2004 at Edinburgh University in Pennsylvania, and her MFA in 2007 from the College of Visual and Performing Arts at Syracuse University. Frazier has completed the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program, and shortly thereafter was appointed critic in photography at the Yale University School of Art. She is currently assistant professor in photography at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She has received numerous grants and awards, including the 2014 Guggenheim Fellowship. Her work has been included in exhibitions at major institutions worldwide, and she was just named the USA Whites Fellow. Dawoud Bey, born in New York, began his career as a photographer in 1975 with a series of photographs entitled Harlem, USA, which was later exhibited in his first one-person exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1979. He has since had numerous exhibitions worldwide at such institutions as the Art Institute of Chicago, the Barbican Center in London, Cleveland Museum of Art, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Detroit Institute of Arts, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the National Portrait Gallery in London, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, among many other opportunities. The Walker Art Center in Minneapolis organized a mid-career survey of his work, Dawoud Bey Portraits, 1975 through 1995, which then traveled to institutions throughout the United States and Europe. A major publication of the same title was also published in conjunction with that exhibition, Class Pictures, which was published by Aperture in 2007. And a traveling exhibition of this work toured to museums throughout the country from 2007 to 2011. I just want to reiterate that the Notion of Family will be signed by the artist immediately after the talk, and there will be a Q&A after the initial conversation between the two artists. So I'd like to introduce LaToya Frazier and Dawoud Bey.
Hi.
Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. I really appreciate seeing so many different people from different areas and avenue of my practice and over the years that I've grown here. So thank you all for coming. I feel like a kid on Christmas Eve. I've waited for this moment ever since I stepped foot in Aperture, when I saw the historic timeline that used to be back on that wall. I used to come in and look at it and think, I want to be on that timeline one day, or I want to contribute to that timeline somehow. You know, it had Paul Strand and Golden, it just had everybody on it that, you know, has made such a historical and significant contribution to the legacy of Aperture, as well as the history of photography, as well as American culture and society. And you know, the biggest thing for me is being able to sit here with Dawoud Bey. I remember the first time that we met in 2008 at the Center for Photography, Woodstock. I was on my residency there, a really important residency that supports artists of color in the African diaspora, run by Ariel Schamberg. And so it was really a pivotal moment for me, and important that I met Dawoud there. And so it's really an honor to be here with you, and it's really an exciting honor to be in Chicago with Dawoud now.
Well, thank all of you for coming out, and I'm really pleased to be doing this conversation. When we met at CPW those years ago, and I first started to become familiar with your work, the thing that I was most immediately taken by was to meet a younger artist, a younger black woman artist, who was working in the medium of photography, but who was clearly using the medium in a way that suggested how, in fact, photography might continue to engage the larger social world in a deeply committed, deeply impassioned way. And in a way that also, and this is also what I found very engaging about my initial coming to your work, was the choice of materials that you were using as an artist. The medium format camera, black and white film, the black and white silver print, and those clearly conscious choices said about your belief as far as what the medium was still had the capacity for. So that was, I guess you would say, the thing that, coming from my own history, made me feel very connected to your practice, and it was very refreshing to see, because I think, you know, the medium is in a place, you know, just at this moment, having gone through the last 2 decades of kind of critical investigation of the veracity of the medium itself, and your work suggested that there was a much deeper, and for my purposes, a much more meaningful way into that conversation. And I appreciate the way in which your work and in which you asserted that. So it's a pleasure to be able to sit here and talk with you in this public context about some of the ideas and histories of your own practice. But because we are here on the occasion of the publication of your first book, I thought that it might be good to begin with the book. What exactly your thinking was about the book form, the form that you gave to the book. It's not exactly a monographic kind of form, but a much more richly layered construct in terms of what the book itself can be, in terms of how the book can wrap itself around your own history, your own concerns, and your own set of ideas. So I'm wondering if we might begin with a conversation about the book, leading up to the book, and your thinking about the book now that the book is in fact published.
Yeah, thank you so much for the framework and the context. I couldn't possibly begin talking about the book without thanking Aperture Foundation, especially for giving me this platform. I think the content, the attitude, and the politics that I'm bringing to the images is challenging for some people, and they may rather look away or step away from it. And I'm really thankful that Aperture gave me full reign with the vision and the story and the information that I wanted to put forth about this history that I'm grappling with. In particular, Leslie Martin had been pushing for me to make the book for a few years, and I kept feeling like something was missing. But I'll back up and say the way that it kind of began to develop. That would have to start with me, being a youth, and ironically, there's this image of this book here, Images of America, Braddock, Pennsylvania. It was published in 2008, and I got it out of the Braddock Library, and I took it to my studio. Now, I had already been making my work since 2002, 6 years prior. And I looked through that book, and by the time I got to the end of the book, I realized that all African Americans were omitted from the history. And this is a photo book published in 2008 by Arcadia Publishing, who publishes books on cities across America all the time. Every city you go to, you can buy one of these books. And so, of course, if they've done it in Braddock, they've done it in every other city and state across the globe, where they've omitted, whether it's African Americans or indigenous people, from our contributions. And so that kind of made me realize, like, I really had to get back to Leslie and start to put the book together, because, it's now 2014, and I saw this in 2008. But initially, I started this work as a teenager, and that's something that I have to go back to and remember. I was only a teenager. I was 16 going on 17 when I really started getting into thinking about making images and picking up the camera. And as a youth, I grew up with my grandmother, and we didn't have a family album. I didn't know much about my family or the way our migration was from the South, or why we were there working in the steel mills and what happened after. And so because of that omission, that gap, that erasure, I began to think about what would it be like if I made a family album or a book of images about the images that Americans don't want to show. Like, that these things are happening. We all go through a lot of trials and different problems and moments in our families and our lives and our relationships, not only to our family, but to our communities, to our states, to our country. But yet, those images are always the ones that are hidden. And so I wanted to start to make images to at least pick up with my existence of looking at my step-great-grandfather Gramps, who's, the stepfather of my grandma Ruby, and my mother. And so when I started, I made this little 4x5. I based it off a 4x5 Polaroid, this little book. I had maybe been shooting for maybe 2-3 years. And so I made this little flip book, and each one of them had a chapter. So it started with Gramps. He's definitely a timeline and very important even in the sequence of the book, because it has to begin with his death, because he's the symbol of the Great Migration. He's the symbol of black men working in the factories, and then there's his death in our home. So he had his chapter, which helped me to be able to recall that legacy and history of the actual backbreaking labor we were doing and how we built the social infrastructure of that town in addition to its actual physical presence. Then when you flip through it, it would go to my grandmother and then my mother. But it was a tiny little book, almost done like a slideshow. I thought of it like, well, if I had a little handheld 4x5 thing that was like a PowerPoint, it could be this intimate thing they could take. Now, I made this in my graphic design class. I never really was good at any of the other assignments, but that time it worked because it had to do with photography. So it started out with that little flip book, and then I continued to grow and mature, but I also had to do a lot of visual critical thinking about my responsibility and accountability to the kinds of images that I was making. And so, you know, the notion of family is 12 years of labor and struggle of me trying to make a visual representation of a completely obliterated and invisible reality that is usually shunned and frowned upon, but trying to see through all of that and find like the power and the camaraderie and the compassion and the love that surrounds all of that loss. And so once I realized that in 2006, I started to write. And at that moment, you know, I had seen a few lectures with Karen A. Weems and then Doug Dubois, who's here. He was also working on his book that's published by Aperture, All the Days and Nights with his family. And so Doug and I would have a lot of conversations about, you know, writing with your images and when you go too far or when it feels like you can't kind of carry that kind of weight or, you know, pushing your family too far and the difference between the private and the public sphere. And so I started writing, and I remember the first time I tested it in a grad seminar, I totally bombed this whole thing. Like it was just not the right tone, it wasn't the right language. So I kept rewriting this and working with it. So the notion of family is it's a 12-year body of work with 6 years of writing text. And then the other thing I'll highlight is that it's not just a photo book or an art book, it's a history book. This is a historical document, and it has to reach farther than the art scene and the photo scene. And I say this because the reason I told Leslie that I wasn't ready is because I knew I was missing a very important voice. And that happened to come when I did not expect it. Tony Buba made a film called Struggles and Still, the African American story about the inequality of what happened to them in the factory. And in that film and that film was made in 1996, and in the film there was a man named Dennis C. Dickerson, and he was a historian. I wrote in a notebook, like I hoped to find him one day, but I put it away because I knew he was in Tennessee and I wasn't going there anytime soon. And so this past year, I was invited to the American Academy in Berlin, and when I got there, I realized that my fellow and my neighbor was this historian, Dennis C. Dickerson. And so, you know, Dennis worked in the factory, his family's from Braddock, he also worked in the factory in Duquesne. So he was a steel worker that became a historian, and he was the first person to write a history that documents and reveals the truth about how African Americans were in Pittsburgh, working all along in the mills since the 1870s. He was told it could never be done, and there was no research, no images, no nothing. And so, you know, Dennis has contributed a very critical essay that frames all of these photographs, in addition to my writing and the photographs themselves and the factual information I provide about what's happening currently in Braddock. That is a really important facet of history that's been being covered and buried for many years. And I thought it was amazing that we crossed the Atlantic to finally meet each other. And like, you know, there it was undeniable, our demeanor, our candor, it was very Pittsburgh, it was very Braddock. And we may be related, we haven't been able to prove that yet. But it's really important that it became that it took that shape, that I was locating myself within a history in addition to a medium or in addition to art history.
Yeah, because look, when I first saw, it wasn't even the actual book, maybe it was the maquette you showed me, but the relationship between the images and the text, the form of the book, and we talked about this, I thought about the collaboration between Amelia Walker and Billy Abernathy, Fundi, and our terribleness. And then of course, Roy DeCuava and the textual collaboration between DeCuava's photographs and Langston Hughes' text. So your work kind of pays tribute to the form while being in a fundamentally significant way different from that for what I would call its quality of self-authorship. And this also goes to the question about the documentary tradition in general. And this is what I find so fascinating about your work, is that you both use and destabilize forms. You use and contest, or you use and reinvent, the book form and the documentary form, which the documentary tradition is not one that is usually thought of as an arena of self-authorship. The history of documentary extending from Jacob Riis's work to Lewis Hines' child labor photographs, in which you have a subject, a disenfranchised or subject that is living in problematic circumstance, and then a photographer comes and documents those circumstances, and that work is then made available to the viewer, who is presumably in a position of greater privilege than the subject, in order to be able to enact change on behalf of the subject, who is clearly not empowered to act on their own behalf. So it is the viewer, whoever that hypothetical viewer, reader, audience is, who then becomes charged with somehow addressing the plight of those described. And that was also, the model for any number of photo essays in Life magazine that were crafted to elicit a very particular response on the part of the readers of Life magazine on behalf of the subjects. And yet, you're using the form of documentary work, but you are simultaneously, through your family and yourself, both the subject and the photographer/author, which is not the conventional model of documentary practice. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about documentary practice, both as an influence and shaper of your work, and then the way in which you pushed against that.
Yeah. So at Edinburgh University, I was studying, my mentor and professor, her name is Kathy Kowalski. And Kathy ran a very strict, tight photo program where she knew she was instilling these values and teaching us how to use our cameras to deal with social injustices. For example, Kathy spent her whole life photographing women in prison, photographing people living in rural poverty areas in Erie, Pennsylvania, as well as photographing how her mother Rose also died. So her work was a total commentary on, when it comes to her mother Rose, on our lack of care for the elderly and how they're living in isolation, pointing to families that are not Black living in rural poverty-stricken areas. and then Women in Prison, running her own programs and workshops. And she came from a literature background and a painting background before she became a photo teacher. And it was during the period, it was 1999, so the late 90s, there were some seminal texts that came out, and I would in particular like to highlight one particular one that we were discussing in the office the other day. And when I studied with Kathy, I had a few options of taking, reading some books and writing essays. And so, of course, there was James Agee and Walker Evans' Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, Roland Barthes' Camberley Sita, but then there was a book that I almost forgot about until just now when we had the conversation in our office, and that was a book called Doing Documentary Work by Robert Coles, and I think that was published in 1995. And so I entered Edinburgh undergrad photo program with an emphasis on social documentary in 1999. And I know at that moment in the 90s, when you came to New York City or you looked at the New York Times, you were mostly seeing the big colorful prints of Cindy Sherman doing her masquerades and portraits, although I always preferred the film stills, like that's what I gravitated towards as a student. And then you would see Gregory Cruikshan's colorful work, or Jeff Wall. So that was the tone that was here. And I think that's interesting because it came during that exhibition that Peter Galassi did at MoMA. Pleasures and Terrors of the was criticized heavily, and so there was all of this conversation already happening, and it pushed away from this whole aesthetic of black and white gelatin silver print because there was no truth. Well, it was easy for me to locate myself back in the classic sense. I totally thwarted and rejected what I was seeing in the mainstream because I read the text during documentary work by Robert Coles. Robert Coles is a child psychologist. He wrote the essays on the story of Ruby Bridges, who was the young African-American girl in New Orleans that experienced a great deal of racism when she was the first student to desegregate elementary schools in New Orleans. So he wrote all of this work dealing with telling the story, coming in, but also looking at what a child is going through, right? The morals, the spirituality, and then the responsibility that a child feels. And I almost forgot about it until I went back and started reading the book this past week. And it was looking at the FSA, thinking about Walker Evans and James Agee, because Coles takes on all of that. So he talks about the FSA, he talks about Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, he talks about outsiders, complacency and the complexity of being an outsider coming in. And so that was my introduction. And I found myself between both of those spaces, because here I was, a 17-year-old teenager trying to deal with what I was witnessing in Braddock without any actual visual representation of it. And so I knew through making those images and reading that book and understanding it that I could try to break through that paradigm. And so the model and the paradigm that I gave myself, the structure to work with, is, well, what is the difference between an outside photographer that's commissioned by the government, that's then corporate sponsored to go in to shoot someone more vulnerable? That triangle, where's the agency and power between that? And the example I always use is, of course, looking at Dorothea Lange. So when my mother and I started making the portraits together, my approach to it was that we were liberating the agency that was denied from Florence Owens Thompson, the subject, the actual subject in Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange. And I constantly kept thinking about that, like how do I come back to this? And knowing that I wanted to take on this history, that meant that the aesthetic, the tools that I was working with, is what I needed to do in order to really genuinely speak back to it. How can I call for a resurgence of social documentary practice today with updating all of those politics and all those dynamic struggles with placing that narrative? And it was another critical moment because at that time I had started out photographing children and families living in homeless shelters in Erie. It was the highest point it had been in 1999. And I remember going to the shelter so much that they thought that I was actually a resident there as well. And when I finally started to shoot, I met a woman where I went back to take her the prints, and it was this woman that brought it in perspective for me. She asked me if I had ever seen, she said she saw a show on PBS that my photographs reminded her of, and she asked me if I knew Gordon Parks. We hadn't gotten to Gordon Parks yet in my class, and so it was this woman in a homeless shelter that was educating me and telling me about this importance of Gordon Parks' work and what he was doing. So I immediately went and bought his books, the catalogs, as many things that I could get to. And that was important because it was a woman outside of the higher education and institution telling me something. So that was an indicator right there that it wasn't from a privileged point of view. It wasn't the institution that has all the knowledge and knows how to use the apparatus. It's someone who was outside that can see for themselves and perceive themselves in the world and see themselves in Gordon Parks' work and identify one of my images as part of that legacy. She didn't have to study at Syracuse or get her undergrad at Edinburgh to know that. And that was a crucial moment. And even then, when I did the exhibition at Edinburgh, I felt like I completely failed because who was I to go into this shelter, right? Another outsider, the same thing that caused James Agee to break down and Walker Evans to completely make still lifes and landscapes. Like, who was I to walk in and shoot these portraits? Yes, my objective, the agenda, was to bring awareness to this high rate of families and children in poverty, but to show it on a privileged campus in a white cube and not be able to make a financial difference in their life or to get them out of the situation really made me feel like, that was a painful lesson I learned and never to do something like that again. That instilled that value for me. I know other people don't work that way, but that was something that affected me personally. And I realized after I did the exhibition, and they were very happy and they got the images and we did a sound recording and everything, but I realized that the reason I was looking at them is because I was thinking about what was going on at home, because it wasn't so different. And so it became time for me to scrutinize myself, to point the camera at me, to be in front of it, to implicate myself, and start to try to figure out, well, what happens if you change that? Like, clearly I'm not the United States government. I am not Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I'm not the New Deal. I cannot provide that money for people who lost their pensions and no health insurance. But is there a way to try to take that on through the photographic process to kind of get there? But definitely the beginning was for me to make images that help me locate myself within that history and within the world. There's a concept out there known as the law of the self-portrait, which is more of a spiritual concept, but understanding that there's your surrounding environment, but then there's also yourself and the way you perceive and think of yourself. I mean, we also keep images in our mind of how we see ourselves in society. So it doesn't stop when you see the portrait of my mother and me, or the situation at hand there, and the dilapidated spaces. It's also the fact that I went through, just like Robert Coles talks about, this type of courage in children when they go through traumatic experiences. I went through a total transformation by making these photographs for 12 years. Like, I'm not the person in the photographs, and neither is my mother or my grandmother. You're only seeing, almost in a way, a fiction of us. I mean, there's a whole other reality outside of the photograph. And so where I start to depart from social documentary is understanding that there's a fiction at play. There's this whole balance between realism and surrealism. And I'm not in disagreement with some of the scrutiny that came with the photographers in the 70s that were questioning the truth-telling of images. I think it's how you contextualize it, frame it, and use it outside, which is why I still stayed committed. And I'm very committed to that resurgence of documentary work, because I think we need it really badly in the Rust Belt area. People have no idea, just like we don't know that water is dried up in California, people have no idea what is going on with people in the Rust Belt. You're seeing an illusion in the media where they want to bring in more neoliberalism and gentrification and redevelopment, but you're not seeing what happened after the whole Reagan era. There's still ramifications and effects of all of that, still having a big hold on a majority of African Americans or people who are so stubborn they didn't leave. So it's not just a black thing, it's a working class thing. And these are real ramifications that no one is looking at, no one is treating. There's no doctors or scientists dealing with any of these types of environmental toxins. And so I'm in solidarity with Louis Hine and Jacob Reeves when you bring them up. They were pushing and fighting against the popular representation, or the lack thereof, of any representation of dealing with the conditions that people were living in. Like, these are not good times. Where I'm from, these are very hard times, and they always were. And so, you know, there's a misunderstanding that this is a post-industrial landscape, a post-industrial place, and that there weren't any people there, which reminds me very much of when America was taken from the indigenous in the first place. We always wipe it clear and clean, and we look to this positive, uplifting image when I don't think that you should turn and look away from these realities, because ultimately, it's the people who are in the lower class or poor that are going to be the first ones that are affected by the environment, and they're the ones that have the answer. And you see the evidence of where we're failing as a society amongst that population.
But given that you are making your work for very imperative reasons, and given that the work is simultaneously made for the subjects as a kind of act of self-affirmation, and then the work also exists in a shifting, larger social world in which there are viewers who are outside of the reality that is described in the photograph, which kind of places the work back in, yet again, potentially that conventional documentary frame where the work is viewed by an audience whose circumstances are rather different from the circumstances being described. How are you continuing to grapple with the question of audience? Because audience is so central to how the work in fact functions in the world, both inside and in the larger sense outside of the circumstances in which the work is made. So how are you grappling with this notion of audience, and how the meaning of the work actually is a very individualized one, dependent on, you know, it means whatever it means to whoever is standing in front of it.
Right.
And within that, there's your intentions. So how are you grappling with this question of intention, audience?
I mean, it's something that I think everyone struggles with, but I've always thought about for many years. And I think I'd like to start out with a very direct example of audience. I mean, when I made the notion of family, what's become known as the notion of family, me and my mother were initially the audience. I was making it for me, for my sanity, to see myself in society, to fight against the media representation in Pittsburgh. And as I've moved out, so the work kind of functions in a very centralized place, and it starts to circulate outward. So you're in the home, within the personal relationship. Then I come outside and start collaborating with community members. Now I'm ultimately up in an airplane giving aerial views to really look down at some of the environmental harm. And when I made the series, and some of them may have gone by, and they're also in the book, there's a moment in the book which the hospital, the demolition of Braddock Hospital, it was the last thing we could take. When they took that hospital away from us, they pretty much ripped the remaining foundation of people who were really born and raised there, and that saw that space as a community space where we all came because everyone has a terminal illness. And so I started collaborating, making portraits with an activist group called Save Our Community Hospital, and you may have seen them in an image holding signs saying, you know, Corbett, where's our healthcare, where's emergency care for Braddock, there's no emergency rooms. I started making that work with them because at that time there was another corporate campaign going showing Braddock as the new frontier. But meanwhile, it was actually this group of elders in the community that were fighting losing the last bit of our foundation. And there was no coverage of it. And no one was talking about that, but they were talking about the corporate campaign. And so in that moment, my audience became those elders from Save Our Community Hospital, because there was no acknowledgement that they even existed, that they were really fighting that reality. On the one hand, we were being packaged and given a fantasy through a Levi campaign, but on the other hand, there was this reality here of them protesting the closure of the hospital. We know healthcare is in a major crisis right now. And so we were the audience showing up to make this image, like, okay, I'll meet you at 8 a.m., at 7 a.m. out front, and we'll shoot this image. And then we come together and meet again. Well, how should we get this out in the public? At that moment, we couldn't rally together quick enough to get a billboard. There's a lot of politics and money around getting a billboard. So I started thinking, okay, what else can I do? And I started making these photolithographs, these protest prints. And at that moment, I was approached to show it in the Whitney Biennial in 2012. And so when it comes to audience for me, I was taking that responsibility to educate people about what the reality was in Braddock, because those ads were here in New York. They were on phone booths, billboards, subways, the big building where the BP gas station is in Soho, the most expensive billboard in this country is right there. And there was a huge towering one there of a hipster urban pioneer. I'm like, this is not a representation of Braddock. And they came to me and people were writing letters and emailing me. And so, you know, that was the path and the way that I took that next step in terms of audience and who's it for, and then how to use a platform to then make the public aware of it. Like, I see my work very much as education. I'm definitely a teacher, and in fact, if you look at the word documentary, the word documentary and documentarian has changed so many times, but the original meaning of documentary is teacher. Like, that's the original meaning of that word. So if you look back in the history, it's always been the root of it. And so, you know, during the duration of the show, again, my work doesn't stop once it's up on the wall or in a book. It's also about me building workshops and talking with people about some of these issues. In that case with the corporate advertisement, it was totally me bringing in that critique of the culture industry, which we learned this from the Frankfurt School theorists, Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, about artists not working for the culture industry, but artists as agents, as cultural agents, pushing back against that. We're supposed to push back against media representation. We're supposed to push back against Hollywood. We're supposed to push back against these things to show another reality that's not being shown, dealing with inequality and injustice. And so it's always been this inside relationship of me making work in my community, about my community, and for my community. But once I take it out into the public, I know that it's about educating people to be aware of this, because every time there's a movement or change in our economy, it affects all of us. And you know, it went from the New Deal and trying to figure out how to help farmers and sharecroppers in the South, which was a devastating blow to our economy, to now living in a knowledge economy today. I mean, neoliberalism, I mean, people don't have jobs, they pretend to do jobs. It's about knowledge economy, sitting at a computer. You're not in a factory. but Braddock is still an industrial town with a factory. And so trying to still realize that perhaps the town, this small town in Pennsylvania, doesn't really fit into the narrative that people are used to in this moment, trying to kind of bring that back and deal with that, because parts of America are still trying to catch up to these major metropolis cities. We're just not there in terms of all that kind of availability and difference of job and work sectors. I mean, 2 weeks ago, the United States Steel Corporation is going to expand. It is now going to expand. It's already 300 acres. Braddock is along the Monongahela River, 9 miles outside of Pittsburgh. It's not even a mile long. So it's going to expand even further. And some of the images you've seen, the aerial views, that means that even more homes and lands are going to be affected. But there's still no representation or documentation or any type of pushback to even call attention to bring any kind of justice. And so my work is certainly trying to build my own narrative archive and history to create my own social justice for this historic event, that it continues to take place and affect and change people's lives.
Well, I think it speaks to your profound sense of wanting to make sure, to the extent that you're able, that the work does what it needs to do, and to take responsibility for that, not only in the making of it, but in the contextualizing of the work and in the shaping of the experience in the world in which the work exists. One thing I'm wondering, to go back to the moment of the publication of this book and what it says about this larger project that has consumed you for a number of years now. If the book is actually a suggestion of a completion, or is it the completion of a chapter? Does it suggest, what exactly does the publication of the book at this particular moment say about the Braddock project? No, I ask that because books come out. We talked about this. Books come out, and that can mean that the project is completed. We published the book, and that's why the book is published, because the project is completed. And I have a feeling that it's a little bit more complicated than that for you. Can you speak to that, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a trilogy. I know. It's 3 books. Now, does Aperture want to take on what the next chapter is? I'm not sure, but it's 3.
Yeah, and I ask that because this is clearly, it's more than a project, it's your life. See, artists and photographers work on a project. You complete the project, and then you publish your class pictures, it's published, it's done. I don't make photographs of high school students anymore. That project is done. Of course, I'm trying to find other ways to remain engaged in the social world and to enact some degrees of transformation. But that project, for me, my work has pretty much been very specifically, project-based. Probably up into Birmingham, which has just taken me on a very deep journey into Alabama. So it's like, okay, the Birmingham project's complete, but I need to go back to Alabama. There's other things that need to be gotten at with that history. So what does the book signify as far as some state of completion or completedness in published form, or how do you think about it?
Well, it's definitely, the end of that first chapter, which would be, Grant's death and the arc that it takes to the loss of the hospital, which my grandmother died in the hospital right before it closed, to the demolition of the hospital. So that's the arc of this book. So, you know, the attitude of, again, out with the old and with the new in Braddock today, here it is in this book, the foundation, the core of why I'm about to do what I'm about to do next. And I haven't figured it all out, but I think a lot of this has to do with the responsibility of once you make these kind of images and you put them out there and you tell the story, right? Louis Hine, Jacob Riis, all these photographers were able to have the government somehow influence policy making or bring some awareness to change working conditions or the way that people were living in their homes. I'm now trying to figure out how to use this book as the platform and the foundation to take that control of that. I grew up in a period where the government had already abandoned us. And so I'm used to having to fend without being able to look for resources, and I watched my grandmother do that. And so again, back to that paradigm, that triangle of, you know, me knowing that I'm not the government, but wondering, like, is there a way that I could push the message and the testimony in this work to start my own foundation? Is there a way that it could be used, whether it's opening a school or a program that deals with these real issues? Because first and foremost, the people that I'm talking about and that these realities are affecting are not at the Art Institute of Chicago. They're not at Syracuse. They're not in this room. And I know that. And so how do I use that? Or is it that I understand, as we discussed once at your home, that there's a limitation? You know, maybe the limitation is that I do just make photography books, but there's this part of me that dreams bigger about wanting to find a way, since that government agency isn't there, since I know that the people I want to have the money will never get the access to the new culture capital flowing in for the creative class that's widening the gap with the poverty of the working class in Braddock. Is there another model or business model that I might need to mature and understand that this could be used to motivate that? The other thing, in addition to why I try to make a master plan for that, is I'll continue to make books, because there's a lot of power in books. When I went to that library and that book wasn't on the shelf with African Americans in Braddock, that really startled me. And so I've gotten through the pain of you know, making the collaborative work with my family, and now it's time to really show the great African Americans that have contributed and done great things. There's a man there who also appears in Tony Ruba's film who helped save the Braddock Carnegie Library. Now, we've been hearing about the Carnegie Library in Braddock because it was in the Carnegie International, and there's more elite people taking buses going out there just to look at the poor black folks and go eat their cheese in the library kind of a gesture. But yet, there's no acknowledgement of the institutional racism there. And so another project that I've been trying to develop and work on is dealing with the men and women that represent and are, you know, are from my grandmother and mother's generation where they weren't allowed in that library. What does it mean for them to walk into the library today and go into one of those rooms that they weren't allowed in? And I started doing that 2 summers ago, which I was so excited to see the last project you did on Birmingham, because I was just struggling with this thing and beside myself, and there Dawoud had already gracefully showed me the way. so I'm standing, you know, in your exhibition, just looking at them. Like, that's it. Like, I was stressed. I'm like, maybe I can't get the people, like, clearly the people from my grandmother's generation passed, and there's other people who will never go in there because they're so hurt from the institutional racism that is still continuing. But when I sat there at the table in the library and I had my camera and I had my recorder, they started coming, right? And they started telling me about the relationship to the town and that library. One man, he was never allowed in that pool. He'll never forget it. It was segregated, he wasn't allowed in there. And today it's just a dilapidated, moldy, empty space that I think they want to turn into a coffee shop. But he wanted to be photographed in the pool even though it was in the condition it's in. we made the photograph in the pool. So they show up, they come to me as they are, they pick the room they weren't allowed in. And just so you understand, that library had a bowling alley, a pool, a gymnasium, a beautiful music hall and theater. And it's just so massive. And it's 2012 when I went in there, and I'd never been past the call stacks. So like, to me, that's the next book. Like, there has to be a way where I've showed all the grit and the pain and the history and like all that struggle that comes with the history of that town, but to also be able to add to the fact that I didn't see those people that worked hard to save the library, right? That pride and dignity of the folks that, you know, were once on placards on the walls that have now been taken down and no one knows where they are. You know, all of it, all the books, everything just removed and turned into something else because it's being redeveloped. So a whole history being taken from you. So continuing to collaborate and work to bring in more invisible representations that kind of tackle these issues of kind of, you know, getting rid of people's histories and cultures. Like, you shouldn't be able to take someone's history from them. And in 2014, I should be able to see myself somewhere. Like, you know, we're born and raised there, gave our lives there. Why can't we see ourselves in any of these public institutions?
That's what we have the potential to do through our work, is to, through the work, reclaim those spaces, both create and reclaim those histories, to assert the contemporary histories, and to have them, you know, this notion of how the work can be made to function, because there's the object, there's the photographic object, which I think, you know, it's important to talk about the object and the level of craft that's brought to the object, which you clearly have a higher regard for, and which I do as well. But then the question of how that object gets situated in the larger social world as an act of reclamation, reclaiming real estate that we have been swept out of. So I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with the library project.
It's going to be a tough one. They put a
Well,
lot of red
that's
tape
the other
around
thing too,
it. A lot of red tape around that one.
You know, we've talked primarily about, you know, the photograph, but your work has the material and form and conceptual language of it has evolved from, you know, the black and white photograph. More recently, we've made large-scale color photographs. We did the Levi's performance. There's the video work. How are you thinking about this ongoing evolution of the form of the work as it continues to speak to the set of ideas, histories, and circumstances? You know, you know, that performance, the denim performance, was a powerful public performance. That's not a photograph, but clearly it was done because it addressed something in a way that perhaps a photograph alone might not have been adequate to the task of addressing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about that evolutionary piece of your practice as you think about what you need to work to do, plus how you want to remain engaged as an artist, as a maker of things.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's the photograph, the object, then there's how the photograph performs in its social context, and then there's performing images. I'm very interested in this idea of how one performs an image that disrupts and destabilizes an image you might have consumed from mainstream media. And so the performance that Dawoud is referring to is a collaboration done with PBS Art 21 and the artist Liz Magic Laser, who I asked to basically give me an assignment, choreograph me and document me, because she tends to work with a lot of theaters, a lot of people that work in the theater in her own practice. But we both share the same theoretical beliefs. So what we did was, so there was the Levi campaign with the commercial saying it was a new frontier and showing all these hipsters carrying their bikes, pretending that they're cleaning up Braddock, working on a farm under the plant. And so, thinking about this denim, the jeans as a symbol, right? Because denim, and in particular Levi's as a brand, I mean, this is such an American kind of commodity itself. It has a huge symbol that is very reminiscent of the power of America and the American flag. But what Liz and I did was we went through, in order to come up with our own association to the propaganda that was fed through the commercial, was we went to old 40s and 50s commercials done on the steel industry. And at that time, they would do these little vignettes, little films of people dressed up as natives and, you know, people working happily in the factory and saying how clean it is, or this is how it went from, like, you know, trying to blow air and make steel and do it ourselves to now having these huge factories. So we went through all of that, and we were able to grab moments of it where they're doing movements, where it's, you know, whether the worker is kind of pushing the steel along or running it through the water, or whether it's the actual steel itself being lifted or moved over on the conveyor belt. And that's what you see here. We were able to take snippets of those, then work with a choreographer to turn them into movements. So then I was able to go out dressed as a Levi worker, wearing Levi boyfriend jeans, which I also thought was absurd. They have a jean called boyfriend jeans. So wearing the boyfriend jeans, I put those on, and there was a photo pop-up studio in Soho that happened to be running the images from Braddock along with other images people were making, because apparently New York City is the biggest amount of photographers live here. So that was their way of giving back to the community. Meanwhile, there was this undertone of a message that was clearly bothering me and Liz. So we went in front of the pop-up studio while everyone was going inside doing their printing, their free printing, and we stood out there and I carried out the reenactments of the images from these commercials of workers pretending to work to build the steel which built the nation's economy and the labor. And so, if you knew the commercials, which some people did, because I made the photolithographs, I worked in layers, different procedures that people would know. So you had the video, you had the lithographs, you had me speaking about it, you had me doing workshops about it. And so it completely kind of countered and went against destabilizing what people thought. Like those that thought, oh, this was good and this is a nice gesture, all of a sudden were like, yes, these were bothering me for some reason and I couldn't figure out why. And then it made people realize how insidious Wyden and Kennedy was the advertising corporation that did this with Levi's. But they did it in Portland, not here in New York. So deconstructing and decoding the image physically through my reenactments. So eventually I do all these reenactments, which causes all the denim to shred off of me onto the ground, which is another critique and comment about this is dyed blue cotton that's very fragile. You're paying, you know, all this money for it, all this branding and identity that comes with it. But my body itself representing the men that worked in the mill, the women that worked in the mill, the injured black body that keeps being overlooked within this whole history, right? How the body's discarded and thrown away and you have this illusion of something that really just disregards the working class or those that gave their lives and bodies and injuries to build this thing. So that's what was happening in it, and I think that I'm interested in this movement of seeing the photograph in its classic sense, questioning, interrogating it, as well as moving into the moving image, looking at that slippage between seeing something in real time and real color versus that gelatin silver print, and then actually performing it for you. So the image, there should be an image of what I did that's imprinted in your mind, not something that's physical or tangible to take away.
I'm not sure exactly where we are with time, but I do know we'd like to take a few questions. Sarah will probably let me know exactly how much time we have for a few questions. Two questions, maybe, three perhaps.
Two to three questions. We have a mic in the back. And for those of you, just so we can wrap up after the questions, we will be setting up a table. So if you're interested in having LaToya, and we have some of Dawoud's class picture books as well, so you can sign it.
Oh.
Get to where we get to. And also I want to say, for those of you who might be frustrated by the slideshow, after our artists step away from the screen, we will lower the lights here and just run the slideshow so you can catch anything you might have missed. In the meantime, let's go ahead with some questions. We have a mic, just raise your hand.
Hi, it's loud. So you mentioned some things about Adorno and kind of fighting against the images that were given or fed through the media. Have you ever experienced anything through your work where you've gotten kind of like pushback as perhaps being unauthentic? The reason I ask this question is because myself as a filmmaker, I've tried to capture certain images of my culture, and in one extent they've been embraced as, okay, yeah, this is a truth, and then in another extent they've kind of been disregarded as being stereotypical or perpetuating a stereotype. So have you ever gone through that experience, and how do you deal with continuing to tell your truth through your images?
I've gone through it the whole time. I'm going through it right now, I'm sure. You know, I'm very clear on why I'm here and what my assignment is here while I'm alive, with very few short years we have. I understand the context that I come from and the geopolitical space that I come from and that my work speaks to and comes from. I don't think it's for me to focus on if people have an opinion. Like, I've kind of grown wary of the conversation around unethical or the conversation about authentic. Everything, look at this moment that we're living in, right? Everything's through social media. Nothing's real. Everything is a total act and a facade. It's a parody of itself. We're living in a moment where America is a parody of itself. And I'm trying to look at one thing that I've been focused on the whole time since I was a child. Why did we live in these conditions? Why was it abandoned? And why didn't I learn about that or see that when I was coming up in the media, right? Why wasn't anyone speaking for my generation to save us from the subsequent decades we've been trying to recover our lives and live whatever a normal life means in this culture? So I don't think it's for anyone who, you know, is really serious and critically aware of the perspective that they're bringing to the culture and society and the present moment that we're in, which is so callous and superficial. Like, I just don't have time. Like, I don't have any more time to be concerned about what someone thinks today. I don't. I know what my mission is. I'm very clear and adamant about that. And I have a responsibility to make these images. And this book is also a warning to those artists that are still there, pretending that the air isn't going to harm them, pretending that the water isn't going to affect them. Like, in the book, Open to the Page, where there's a self-portrait, I break down all the different things that the EPA has cited the United States Steel Corporation for, and how to this day it has still not been dealt with. We're talking about a factory since 1872, billowing out this toxicity in a very tight, condensed, small region. So, you know, these things just don't I'm not going to let them deter me from what I'm focused on. I'm committed to the history, the medium, the practice, trying to move it forward in creative ways. But I don't think that you should allow someone to discourage you or push you away from you trying to make a visual representation of your culture.
LaToya, I was wondering if you could speak more of your experiences working so closely with your mother in this context, and how the medium of photography sort of defined a new relationship for you and your mother.
I wish you could say, I wish I could tell you a good happy lullaby. I wish I could. I mean, I think it was really important to go through the process, because there wasn't really a space or an opportunity for us to really engage with each other and deal with our sameness and our difference, right? I mean, a lot of my work is very reminiscent. I bring up in the very first page Jamaica Kincaid's novels, because in a way, the notion of family is also like reading a literature book, like looking at nonfiction or a novel or someone writing about their life, right? In Jamaica Kincaid's case, she's also dealing with loss and tension between her mother, these women, these young, these young characters she creates that are trying to find themselves in this post-colonial kind of world. So in that sense, I'm just bringing forth this experience and narrative and story of a time and moment in existence. But I don't photograph my mother anymore. We're not making photographs. And it's, her health has gotten to a point where it's time to put the camera away. And I think that it's, you never see the moment coming until it hits you, and you just know not to do it anymore. Like, there was a moment where I wouldn't photograph my grandmother anymore, even though I knew it was very important to make the photograph of the still life of her dolls and us standing there, because that was that loss of that triangle, that other set of relationships and negotiations in the photograph. But, there's a time to shoot and a time when not to shoot. And our relationship is almost like a fiction for you, the outside viewer, to look on, to project yourself on, to take in and see yourself in that, perhaps. But then there's this other reality that is still very private, that is not public, that is my relationship with my mother. I think one of the best things and the greatest thing that we did was that we took our work to a church. A video I won't even look at anymore, called A Mother to Hold, that we made. We screened it at a church of all places with these teens that had been locked up and were facing their last criminal offense. And it was powerful. It wasn't documented, no one knows about it, it's not written about, I seldom talk about it, but I'm sharing it tonight because through that encounter with these teens who were locked up for selling drugs and dealing with all their issues, she was able to gain this power and platform and a voice that has always been denied from her. Even my own work, what I'm doing, I can't bring her the agency that she needs, right? So I still end up trapped in a triangle like Dorothea Lange and Florence Owens Thompson, same thing. But in that moment, she was able to use that as a platform to reach people how she wanted and to change her own public image. So, there's the work and then there's our personal relationship. And I think they're parallel universes running together, but they're two very different things.